In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the night had just settled into a calm lull. Streetlights cast an amber glow across the quiet road, and most of the residents were already winding down for the evening. The last thing anyone expected was the shocking incident that would unfold. An incident that would ripple across the internet, sparking debates and sending shockwaves through the community. In the dimly lit driveway of his family's home, 32-year-old Marcus Hayes was resting in the driver's seat of his car, exhausted from an endless shift at the factory. He'd decided to close his eyes for just a few minutes before heading inside to avoid waking up his wife and young daughter. He had done this before, on particularly grueling nights, choosing to gather his thoughts in the car before going inside. But that night, unbeknownst to Marcus, he'd caught the attention of two patrolling officers who were making their usual rounds. The officers noticed his car parked with the engine off, but with a faint glow coming from inside the vehicle. The dashboard lights dimming as Marcus drifted into a light sleep. The officers, new to the area and eager to act on any suspicious activity, decided to investigate. Before we dive further into this gripping story, take a moment to show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Stories like this highlight the importance of accountability and awareness, and with your support, we can keep shedding light on cases that might otherwise be overlooked. Now, back to the story. The two officers, Officer Daniels and Officer Brooks, cautiously approached the vehicle. They didn't bother knocking on the window or announcing their presence. Instead, they circled the car, assessing the situation. Without a word, Officer Daniels radioed in, reporting that they had a suspicious individual in a parked vehicle. "Looks like he's asleep," Brooks muttered, peering through the window. Daniels, whose body cam later revealed an overzealous tendency, was less patient. "We're not here to tuck him in. Let's make sure he's not up to anything shady." The officers exchanged a nod, deciding to take matters into their own hands without trying to wake Marcus up gently. Brooks hesitated, seeming unsure about the approach. But he kept silent, not wanting to question his partner's methods. In the silence of the night, the first zap of the taser jolted through the car. Marcus's body convulsed as he awoke in terror, his mind racing to catch up with the sudden pain ripping through him. "What's happening?" he managed to scream out, eyes wide and filled with panic. But the officers offered no explanations. In fact, before Marcus even had a chance to comprehend what had happened, they tasered him again. A second, violent shock. His muscles spasmed involuntarily, and he struggled to breathe, his mind clouded with fear and confusion. By this time, a few neighbors had started peeking through their windows, drawn by the commotion outside. They watched in horror as Marcus was tased a third time, his body slumping against the car seat. He was barely conscious, his vision blurring and his voice weak as he begged, "Please, stop." It was only after the third shock that Officer Brooks, visibly shaken, finally spoke up. "Daniels, I think we've gone too far. He wasn't doing anything. He was just sleeping." But it was too late. Marcus lay limp, struggling to regain control of his body, his mind still reeling from the trauma. The officers quickly realized the gravity of the situation. Marcus, now coherent enough to understand what had happened, began shouting, his voice hoarse but filled with anger. "I didn't do anything. You attacked me without reason." His words, though weak, carried an undeniable weight. And that's when things took a turn that the officers hadn't anticipated. Several neighbors, having witnessed the entire event from their windows and even recorded parts of it on their phones, stepped out of their homes. They approached the scene, their phones raised, capturing every detail. "We saw everything," one neighbor called out. "He was just sleeping in his car, and you attacked him without warning." Realizing the gathering crowd, Officer Daniels tried to defuse the situation. "Please, folks, stay back. This is a police matter." But the neighbors weren't buying it. "This is our neighbor," another woman shouted. "You didn't even give him a chance to speak before you tasered him. We have it all on video." Marcus, still struggling to sit up, felt a surge of relief and anger as he heard the voices of his neighbors supporting him. The pain from the taser still lingered in his muscles, but the presence of witnesses gave him the strength to sit up straighter. "You're gonna regret this," he spat out, his eyes locking onto the officers with a fierce determination. "I'm pressing charges." As the officers realized the weight of what they'd done, with witnesses and video evidence surrounding them, a sense of panic flickered in their eyes. They quickly retreated, offering feeble explanations to the gathering crowd. "We thought he was a threat. It was standard procedure." But the neighbors weren't convinced. They'd seen enough. Within hours, the incident was all over social media, and by morning, local news stations had picked up the story. Videos from multiple angles showed the officers tasing Marcus without provocation, and the story quickly gained traction, igniting a wave of outrage across the community. The police department, facing immense public backlash, had no choice but to respond. They placed Officer Daniels and Officer Brooks on suspension, pending an investigation. But the public wasn't satisfied with a temporary measure. They wanted justice for Marcus, and they wanted accountability for the officers who had abused their power. The outrage over the incident grew like wildfire, spreading from local social media pages to national news outlets. People were shocked and appalled that an innocent man had been brutally tased without any warning, just for falling asleep in his own car. As the footage circulated online, viewers couldn't believe how quickly the situation had escalated, and they demanded answers. Meanwhile, Marcus Hayes sat at home, grappling with the aftermath of the incident. His body still ached from the electrical shocks, and his nerves were frayed. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt a surge of anxiety, flashing back to the moment he was jolted awake with a taser. The experience left him feeling violated, helpless, and furious. But Marcus was determined not to let this go. He wasn't going to be another silent victim swept under the rug. With the support of his neighbors and the evidence from the videos, he decided to take legal action. He reached out to a well-known civil rights lawyer, a fierce advocate with a reputation for holding law enforcement accountable. The lawyer, Sarah Green, met with Marcus the very next day. She was sympathetic and visibly disturbed by the video footage. "They didn't give you a chance, Marcus," she said, shaking her head as she watched the video on her tablet. "This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable. We're going to make sure they're held accountable." Sarah wasted no time in filing a formal complaint against Officers Daniels and Brooks. She also prepared to sue the police department for violating Marcus's civil rights. The public response was overwhelming. People across the country rallied in support of Marcus, flooding the police department's social media pages with demands for justice. The hashtag #Justice for Marcus began trending on Twitter, bringing even more attention to the case. As the case moved forward, the police department faced a PR nightmare. They released a public statement claiming they were deeply concerned about the incident and that an internal investigation was underway. However, for many, this was too little, too late. The footage was clear, and no amount of carefully crafted statements could erase the images of Marcus being brutally tased while asleep. Pressure mounted on the police department to provide answers. Activist groups organized peaceful protests outside the station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus," "Stop Police Brutality," and "Accountability Now." Community leaders stepped forward, demanding that the officers be fired, not just suspended. They argued that if officers could attack an innocent man in his own car without provocation, what did that say about the safety of the rest of the community? In response to the public outcry, the police department expedited its investigation, bringing in outside investigators to ensure transparency. Officer Daniels and Officer Brooks were called in for questioning. They were placed in separate rooms and grilled on their actions that night. Officer Daniels, whose overzealous actions had triggered the incident, tried to defend himself, claiming he thought Marcus was a potential threat. But the investigators weren't buying it. A potential threat? He was asleep in his car. You didn't attempt to wake him up, didn't identify yourselves. You just went straight to the taser, one investigator stated coldly. Meanwhile, Officer Brooks, visibly shaken and remorseful, admitted he had felt uneasy about the entire encounter. I knew we should have just knocked on the window, he confessed. But Daniels was determined to go in strong. I didn't question him. I should have. The investigation revealed even more disturbing details. It turned out that Officer Daniels had a history of complaints against him for excessive force. Complaints that had been quietly filed away without proper disciplinary action. This revelation poured fuel on an already blazing fire, igniting even more outrage within the community. With mounting pressure, the police department had no choice but to escalate the case. Daniels was placed on unpaid suspension, and Brooks was given a stern warning. But for Marcus, this wasn't enough. He wanted accountability, not only for what had happened to him, but to ensure this never happened to anyone else again. As the lawsuit progressed, Marcus found himself thrust into the public eye. News crews frequently appeared outside his home, hoping for a statement. He struggled with the attention at first, but his lawyer encouraged him to use his platform to bring awareness to the issue. Marcus decided to give a televised interview, sharing his story with the world. Sitting in front of the camera, he took a deep breath before speaking. "I was just trying to get some rest after a long day," he said, his voice calm but laced with anger. "Next thing I know, I'm being attacked by the people who are supposed to protect us. I'm not here to vilify all police officers, but there has to be accountability. No one should have to go through what I went through." The interview struck a chord with viewers, and Marcus's story continued to gain traction. His courage inspired others to come forward with their own stories of unjust treatment, creating a powerful movement demanding change in policing practices. Local leaders took notice, and soon, city officials began discussing new policies to increase police accountability. A month later, the trial finally began. Marcus sat in the courtroom, surrounded by friends, family, and supporters. The prosecution presented the damning video evidence, along with testimonies from his neighbors who had witnessed the incident. They recounted how the officers had acted without provocation, confirming that Marcus had been asleep in his car, minding his own business. Officer Daniels, in his testimony, continued to insist that he'd acted within protocol, but his justifications fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence. His attorney attempted to paint Marcus as a potentially dangerous individual, a tactic that backfired as the defense struggled to explain why they hadn't even bothered to wake him up first. When it was time for Officer Brooks to testify, he surprised everyone by admitting his regret. "I should have stopped him," he confessed, casting a nervous glance at Daniels. "I knew it didn't feel right. I'm sorry, Marcus. To you and your family." The courtroom was silent as Marcus looked over at Brooks. Although he felt anger towards both officers, he couldn't deny that Brooks's remorse seemed genuine. But Daniels, who showed no sign of regret, only fueled Marcus's determination to seek justice. In a powerful closing statement, Sarah Green addressed the jury. Marcus Hayes trusted his community, his neighbors, and his local police to keep him safe. That trust was shattered when he was brutally attacked for doing nothing more than resting in his own car. Today, you have the chance to send a message that no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Daniels was found guilty of using excessive force, while Brooks received a formal reprimand for his failure to intervene. The judge handed down a sentence that included a suspension without pay and mandatory retraining for both officers, emphasizing the importance of de-escalation and proper procedure. The courtroom erupted in applause as the judge concluded the sentencing. For Marcus, it wasn't about revenge. It was about setting a precedent. As he stepped outside the courthouse, he was greeted by a wave of supporters. The victory was bittersweet, but he felt a sense of closure. He had taken a stand not just for himself, but for anyone who'd ever been wronged by those in power. As Marcus addressed the crowd, he ended with a powerful message. This isn't the end. We need to keep pushing for change, so no one else has to live in fear of the people who are meant to protect us. If you believe in this cause, if you believe in accountability, join me. Keep sharing stories like mine. Keep raising your voice. Together, we can make a difference. And if you support justice and accountability, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let's make sure stories like Marcus's are never ignored again.